The house was quieter than usual that evening, the kind of silence that wraps around you and makes you notice every little thing. I sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the space, while he moved through the rooms with a sluggishness that felt unfamiliar. He wasn't saying much, his eyes often fixed on something distant, as if the world around him existed on a different plane. It was subtle, but I could feel the shift, a distance growing between us, inch by inch, day by day. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just tired, or stressed from work. But then came the late nights, the unexplained absences, the way he would check his phone quickly when I entered the room. These small cracks in our routine started to widen, and with them, a nagging suspicion settled in my chest. It felt like the simplest explanation, the one that lined up with every late dinner, every vague excuse, every moment when his warmth seemed to evaporate. Cheating. The word whispered behind my thoughts, and part of me clung to it, not because I wanted to be hurt, but because it was something I could understand, something I could fight against. The emotional distance was the hardest part. It wasn't just about physical presence or absence. It was the way he stopped sharing his day, the way laughter became rare, the way his eyes no longer sought mine across the room. I found myself searching for signs, for proof, even as I hoped I was wrong. Denial was a fragile shield. I wrapped myself in it when the evidence felt too heavy, convincing myself that maybe it was just a phase, a rough patch we could get through. But deep down I knew. The secrets hidden in his silence, the walls he built around himself, they spoke louder than any words. I imagined confrontation, the relief of knowing the truth, the chance to salvage what was left. Yet, as the nights grew longer and the gaps between us stretched wider, I realized that if it was infidelity, at least it was a truth I could grasp. What lay beneath the surface, the truth I was yet to uncover, promised to be far more complicated, far more painful. I held my breath, waiting for the moment when the pieces would fall into place. In that quiet, ordinary evening, the fear settled in. Some truths are harder to face than betrayal itself. And as the shadows deepened in our home, I sensed that whatever I was about to discover would change everything. Not just our marriage, but the foundation of trust we had built together. Many of us have felt that uneasy knot in our stomach, the silent suspicion that something isn't quite right in a relationship. It's a quiet voice that stirs doubts, whispers of infidelity or deception. But few are truly prepared for the moment when suspicion unravels into something far darker, something that shakes the very ground beneath your feet. What I was about to uncover was not just a breach of trust, but a revelation that would rewrite the meaning of every glance, every word exchanged under the same roof. I invite you to stay with me through this story, because the truth unfolds slowly, like a shadow creeping across a room, revealing details that change everything you thought you knew. It's not just about betrayal, it's about the fragile threads that hold two lives together, and what happens when they begin to fray in ways you never imagined. This is more than a tale of heartbreak, it's a journey through the quiet desperation of facing a reality that's far worse than suspicion alone. If you've ever trusted your gut in a relationship, if that inner voice has ever guided or warned you, please take a moment to like this video. And if you've faced a moment where the truth was more painful or complicated than you expected, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. Your story matters, and sometimes, knowing we are not alone in our struggles is the first step toward healing. As the evening deepened and the house grew still, I braced myself for what was coming, knowing that with every passing moment, the fragile illusion we had lived under was about to shatter. The truth was waiting, patient and unyielding, ready to transform suspicion into something far more profound. In the quiet moments before dawn, the subtle shifts in behavior began to settle into my awareness, though I hesitated to give them weight. The first change was the guarded way the phone was handled. Once casually left on the table or within easy reach, it now seemed to be a shield, clutched tightly or whisked away whenever I entered the room. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than a desire for privacy, a natural boundary everyone deserves. Perhaps there were messages or calls of a sensitive nature, or simply the need to unwind without interruptions. I reminded myself that trust includes respect for personal space, and so I tried not to let the unease creep in. Then came the unexplained absences, moments when the familiar rhythm of shared days faltered. Time away from home grew longer, the excuses more vague, a last-minute meeting, a sudden errand, a friend needing support. Each departure seemed plausible on its own, something that could happen to anyone caught in the unpredictable demands of life. I found reasons to believe in the benign: stress at work, an overactive social calendar, or perhaps a sudden urge to escape the monotony that sometimes settled heavily over us. It was easier to accept these explanations than to confront the gnawing feeling that something was amiss. Alongside these physical signs, emotional withdrawal took root, subtle yet unmistakable. Conversations became shorter, laughter less frequent, and the warmth that once filled our shared space cooled into a quiet reserve. When I reached out, the responses were polite but distant, as if an invisible barrier had been erected between us. I told myself that everyone has moments when they retreat inward, periods of reflection or fatigue that are not uncommon. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the weight of worries I couldn't see. Compassion urged me to give space, to avoid pressing too hard and risking further distance. Individually, these behaviors might have passed unnoticed or been easily rationalized. A guarded phone, a missed evening, a quiet mood, each could be explained away by everyday circumstances. But together, they began to form a pattern, a mosaic of small fissures in the foundation of our connection. Still, I clung to the hope that this was temporary, a phase that would pass as quickly as it had come. The mind is adept at weaving narratives that protect the heart, at softening the edges of discomfort to maintain peace. In those moments of reflection, I wrestled silently with the tension between intuition and reason, between suspicion and trust. The desire to believe in the goodness of what we had built was strong, yet the accumulating signs whispered a story I was reluctant to hear. It was a delicate balance, acknowledging what I saw without leaping to conclusions, holding space for doubt without surrendering to despair. Each day, the puzzle pieces edged closer to revealing a picture I was not yet ready to face, but could no longer ignore. The moment I started to convince myself he was cheating, it wasn't because I wanted to believe the worst, it was because it felt like the only explanation I could handle. My mind searched for a narrative that, while painful, was at least familiar and contained. Infidelity, as destructive as it was, fit into stories I had heard before, stories I could place into neat categories. It was something I could grapple with, something with a recognizable shape. Other possibilities, the idea that he might no longer care, or that everything we had built was meaningless, felt too vast, too shapeless. Those thoughts threatened to unravel not just our relationship, but the foundation of who I thought I was and what our shared life represented. I told myself that if he was cheating, it meant there was a reason, a cause that made sense. It was easier to accept betrayal as a breach of trust by choice, rather than an existential failure of love itself. Cheating implied an action, a decision, something concrete and external to my own worth. It was a wound, but one I could bandage and heal from. If, on the other hand, the truth was that he had simply fallen out of love or never truly loved me the way I believed, that would mean the whole story I had told myself about us was a lie. That possibility was too unbearable, too fragmented, threatening to erase the very memories and dreams I had clung to. There was also the familiarity of the scenario. Stories of infidelity are common, almost expected in the narratives we live by. They come with scripts: anger, confrontation, maybe forgiveness or moving on. It felt like I was stepping into a role I could perform, a role that offered some control over the chaos. Doubt was a cruel companion, but suspicion gave me a direction. It allowed me to hold on to some semblance of order in my mind, because the alternative, accepting that everything was irreparably broken, was like staring into an abyss without an edge. I found myself replaying moments, looking for clues that could be explained by betrayal. Late nights alone, the guarded phone, the subtle shift in tone. Each sign, as vague as it was, became a thread I could pull to weave a story that made sense. I told myself that if he was cheating, at least I was not deluding myself about the reality between us. It was a way to keep the emotional damage contained to a specific act, rather than allowing it to seep into every corner of my being. This self-deception, painful as it was, served as a shield. It kept me from falling into despair, from losing grip on who I was beneath the layers of pain and confusion. Cheating, as damaging as it was, felt like a wound I could locate, diagnose, and eventually treat. The alternatives were amorphous shadows threatening to darken every memory, every hope I held. My mind settled on this painful yet manageable truth because it was the one that preserved a sliver of meaning and, paradoxically, allowed me to keep moving forward, even if just barely. The moment the idea of looking crossed my mind, it unleashed a tempest within me. I wasn't simply debating whether to uncover a secret. I was wrestling with a profound internal struggle between the desperate need for clarity and the paralyzing dread of what that clarity might reveal. It was not jealousy fueling this turmoil, far from it. Rather, it was a battle for psychological survival, a fight to regain some sense of control over a world that had suddenly turned alien and fragile beneath my feet. Guilt was the first shadow to creep in. The thought of invading someone else's privacy, of violating a boundary that might never have been meant to be crossed, weighed heavily on my conscience. Could I justify this act? Was it fair to both of us? The guilt gnawed at me because it wasn't about suspicion alone. It was about trust, about respect for the person I thought I knew. To look would mean abandoning that trust, stepping into a role I never intended to play. Yet paradoxically, that very guilt also underscored the stakes. I needed to know, not out of spite, but out of a desperate desire to confront reality head-on, to stop wandering in the dark without bearings. Fear, too, held me tight in its grasp. The fear of confirmation was almost unbearable. What if the worst was true? What if looking shattered the fragile peace I had managed to cling to? Ignorance, after all, had a strange power. It allowed me to keep some part of my life untouched, uncontaminated by suspicion's corrosive acid. But that same ignorance was a prison, locking me away from truth and healing. The uncertainty was a slow poison, eroding my sense of self, and I knew that only by facing the unknown could I hope to rebuild anything resembling normalcy. At the core of this conflict was the need for clarity, not simply to catch a betrayal, but to understand what lay beneath the surface of our fractured relationship. I needed to see the truth to navigate the path forward, whether that meant confronting pain, making difficult choices, or finding a way to forgive. It was about reclaiming my own agency, refusing to be swept away by the tides of doubt and suspicion without a fight. This was not an act born of jealousy, which often demands retribution or seeks to punish. This was a survival mechanism, a psychological imperative to reclaim my identity and sanity amid chaos. The internal battle wasn't swift or neat. It unfolded in cycles of hesitation and resolve, each step measured against the risk of emotional devastation. I told myself that knowing the truth, however painful, would eventually bring relief. The alternative, living with the gnawing uncertainty, felt like a slow unraveling, a gradual loss of who I was and what I could become. I was caught between the dread of what I might find and the even greater dread of never knowing at all. In the end, it wasn't a simple decision but a culmination of countless small moments of courage, doubt, and self-reflection. The choice to look was an act of reclaiming my story, of refusing to be a passive victim of circumstance. It was a step toward psychological survival, a way to face the fractures in my life with eyes wide open, even if what I saw threatened to break me. This internal battle was perhaps the hardest struggle of all, the fight to decide whether to see the truth or remain shrouded in the shadows of uncertainty. I wasn't prepared for what I found, though part of me had expected something, anything, to explain the gnawing emptiness that had lodged itself deep inside. The box was tucked away in a corner of the attic, beneath a loose floorboard I had only recently discovered while searching for old photographs. It was small, unassuming, wrapped in a faded cloth that felt rough beneath my fingers. There was no label, no hint of its contents, only the faint scent of something metallic and faintly sweet, like rust mixed with something else I couldn't place. When I lifted the cloth, I hesitated. The air around me seemed to thicken, the dim light of the attic casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers. Inside the box was a collection of objects that didn't align with any story I thought I knew. There were no letters, no photographs, no familiar keepsakes. Instead, there were fragments, pieces that didn't fit together neatly or comfortably, each one whispering a secret I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. One item was a small, cracked mirror, its surface cloudy and scratched, reflecting a distorted version of the room behind me. Another was a bundle of thin, brittle papers, edges jagged as if torn hastily, covered in symbols and handwriting that seemed almost like a code. The ink was faded, but the shapes were unsettling, loops and lines that didn't form words I recognized, yet carried a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. I couldn't tell if they were a message or a warning. There was also a tiny carved figure, no taller than my thumb, made from dark wood. Its features were rough, abstract, and strangely familiar, like something I had seen in the corner of a dream I couldn't quite remember. It seemed to watch me, though I knew it was just an object, inert and silent. Still, I felt its gaze, a weight that pressed down on my chest. Most perplexing was the absence of any direct link to another person. I had expected to find clues pointing to someone else, another woman perhaps, whose presence had been kept hidden. Instead, what I held was evidence of something else entirely, something secretive but not necessarily human in the way I had imagined. It was as if I had stumbled onto a quiet, persistent undercurrent beneath the surface of my family's history, something that had been carefully concealed, not out of shame, but out of a need to protect, or perhaps to forget. I sat there, the box resting on my lap, my mind refusing to settle. The confusion was not sudden or overwhelming, but slow and creeping, like a fog that rolled in unnoticed until it had swallowed everything familiar. I questioned what I had seen, doubted my own interpretation. Was I reading too much into these objects? Was this an elaborate misdirection, or simply remnants of a forgotten habit, a private eccentricity? Nothing made sense, yet everything felt significant. The usual markers of meaning were absent, replaced by this vague, unsettling feeling that something was deliberately hidden, not just facts or people, but something darker and less tangible. This was not a secret of betrayal or loss, but an enigma of silence and absence, a quiet disturbance that unsettled the ground beneath my understanding. I closed the box slowly, the weight of it heavier than before. I needed to sit with this confusion, to let it settle without forcing clarity. The truth, if it was ever to come, would reveal itself in time. But for now, all I had was this strange collection, a puzzle without edges, and the hollow space it left inside me that refused to be filled. As I sat there, the silence around me thickened, pressing against my thoughts like a storm cloud ready to burst. The box, with its concealed contents, felt less like a container of secrets and more like a mirror reflecting my own tangled emotions. At first, my mind clung to the simplest explanation, that infidelity was the root of all this pain. But as the hours slipped by, a subtle shift began. It wasn't about betrayal in the way I had imagined, not about a physical act or a single moment of weakness. It was something far more complex, far more insidious. The realization crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly. I began to understand that the real breach wasn't about someone else's presence or absence, it was about the erosion of trust itself. The betrayal lay in the layers of deception, the obsessive secrecy that had woven itself into everyday life, shading every interaction with doubt and suspicion. It wasn't just about who was with whom, it was about the way truth had been twisted, hidden, and weaponized. The unspoken code of honesty that had once been the bedrock of our relationship was fractured, perhaps beyond repair. My mind replayed moments I had overlooked, the furtive glances, the sudden defensiveness, the compulsive need to check a phone or close a laptop whenever I entered the room. At first, I had chalked these up to mere distractions, everyday quirks of modern life. But now, with this new lens, they revealed themselves as symptoms of a deeper obsession, a behavior that threatened the foundation of everything we had built together. It wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a pattern of secrecy that undermined the very essence of trust. I felt a strange mixture of anger and sorrow. Anger because the betrayal wasn't simple or straightforward, it was a slow poison, seeping into the corners of our shared life. Sorrow because I realized how much I had ignored, how often I had chosen comfort over confrontation, hoping that silence might protect us both. But silence had only allowed the divide to grow wider. This mental shift marked a turning point. I no longer sought to pinpoint a single act of infidelity as the cause of my pain. Instead, I grappled with the broader truth that what had been hidden was less about physical betrayal and more about emotional exile. The obsession with secrecy, the deliberate withholding of truth, had created a chasm of isolation. It was a betrayal of the trust that should have been unbreakable, a quiet fracture that left me questioning everything. In that moment, I understood that rebuilding would require more than forgiveness for a single mistake. It demanded confronting the patterns of deception and obsession that had taken hold, acknowledging the damage done to the foundation of our relationship. The path ahead was uncertain, and the weight of that uncertainty pressed heavily on me. But clarity, at last, had begun to emerge from the shadows, revealing a truth far more complicated than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the act itself, the betrayal that anyone might recognize or condemn. What made it feel unbearable was the realization that this secret wasn't a momentary lapse or a fleeting indiscretion. It was something sustained, something woven into the fabric of who he had been alongside me, quietly shaping our days and nights without my knowledge or consent. More than a breach of trust, it was a revelation of a hidden self, one I had never agreed to share my life with but had been living under the same roof all along. There's a distinct difference between discovering someone's mistake and uncovering a side of them that's been carefully concealed, growing in the dark while you believed you knew them completely. Cheating, as painful as it is, often feels like a rupture, a break in the narrative that can be addressed, talked through, or sometimes left behind. But this was different. It was a secret that implied a parallel story, a secret identity that had persisted for so long, it became a part of our reality without ever being acknowledged. That hidden side wasn't just a shadow, it was a silent presence shaping his choices, his moods, his very essence in ways I hadn't comprehended. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on me, not just because of what he had done but because it meant I had been living with a version of him that was incomplete, even false. It was as if the man I loved had been wearing a mask, and beneath it lay a stranger whose desires, fears, and compulsions I had no hand in shaping or understanding. The worst part was that I had never consented to this hidden dimension of our relationship. It had been foisted upon me without warning or explanation. I felt like a passenger on a journey I hadn't agreed to take, trapped in a narrative where the author had been rewriting the story behind my back. That secret wasn't just about deception, it was about exclusion and control. It suggested that there were parts of his life and mine that belonged solely to him, kept deliberately separate from our shared existence. It was a boundary I hadn't known existed, a line crossed so quietly that I only noticed once everything had shifted irreversibly. The realization cut deeper than betrayal because it meant I couldn't trust the story he'd told me, the version of himself he had shown. I was forced to question everything, from the smallest gestures to the grandest promises, wondering which were genuine and which were performed for a role I had been unwittingly asked to play. In that moment, the secret felt like a sickness, something corrosive that had taken root beneath the surface, poisoning the foundation of our life together. It wasn't merely an act of infidelity, it was a sustained pattern of concealment that revealed a fractured identity, one that I had no part in constructing and no way to reconcile. The hurt wasn't just in what I discovered, but in the knowledge that this hidden side had thrived precisely because I was kept in the dark. The silence around it was as damaging as the secret itself, a testament to how deeply it had been embedded in the shadows of our shared world. Facing this truth meant grappling with a reality that was more complex and unsettling than I had ever imagined. It wasn't a matter of forgiveness or forgetting, it was about reckoning with the fact that the man I thought I knew had been living a parallel existence, one that I had never consented to join. The secret wasn't just a wound, it was a revelation of a hidden life, one that demanded honesty, confrontation, and a courage I wasn't sure I possessed. Looking back now, I see the subtle signs that had been there all along, buried beneath layers of denial and hope. The casual excuses, the unexplained absences, the conversations that felt rehearsed or incomplete, they weren't random cracks in the facade but deliberate fragments of a larger, more painful puzzle. Each moment I had dismissed or rationalized suddenly took on a new, sharper clarity. A phrase here, a gesture there, a glance that didn't quite meet mine, they all whispered truths I had refused to hear. I recall the nights when his phone would buzz quietly, and he'd quickly silence it or step away without explanation. At the time, I told myself it was work, stress, something ordinary. Now, it's clear those interruptions weren't incidental but necessary for maintaining a double existence. The emotional gaps I had felt, those cold silences and the growing distance between us, were not signs of disinterest or exhaustion but symptoms of a secret carefully guarded. It was as if I had been living beside a stranger who wore my husband's face but carried a hidden story I was never meant to uncover. The conversations that once seemed trivial, his vague references to meetings or sudden trips, gained new meaning. They were not mere fabrications but calculated stories designed to shield the truth. I remember asking questions, probing gently, hoping to find reassurance or an explanation I could accept. Instead, I was met with deflection, avoidance, or half-truths that now feel like betrayals. The pattern of deception was so woven into the fabric of our daily life that by the time the full truth surfaced, it felt less like a shock and more like the inevitable unveiling of something long concealed. This reframing of my entire history with him has been disorienting. Memories once cherished now feel tainted by the shadow of deceit. The shared laughter, the quiet moments of connection, even the arguments, they all carry a hidden subtext. I wonder how much of what I experienced was authentic and how much was a carefully constructed illusion. It's painful to realize that trust was not merely broken in a single moment but eroded bit by bit, over months and years, under the guise of normalcy. Yet, despite the sting of betrayal, this new perspective has given me a strange kind of clarity. I no longer question my instincts or blame myself for the gaps I once felt but couldn't explain. Recognizing the depth and duration of the deception has freed me from confusion and self-doubt. It has allowed me to confront the reality without the fog of denial clouding my judgment. The truth, while harsh, has become a foundation upon which I can begin to rebuild, not with him, but with myself. Ultimately, seeing the pattern exposed how long this hidden life had been intertwined with mine, silently shaping my world without my consent or awareness. It's a bitter realization, but one that brings with it the possibility of honesty and healing. The journey ahead may be uncertain and painful, but at least it will be traveled in full light, no longer shadowed by secrets or lies. In the quiet aftermath of uncovering the truth, a profound shift took root within me, not a sudden eruption of anger or confrontation, but a steady, aching clarity. It was as if a fog had lifted, revealing a landscape I had never truly seen before. The marriage I thought I had, that delicate tapestry woven with hopes and shared moments, was more illusion than reality. The realization settled slowly, like a weight pressing gently but persistently on my chest, demanding acknowledgement. I began to understand that what I had believed in was never whole. It was a fragmented reflection, a shadow play where only certain parts were illuminated for me to see. The love, the partnership, the mutual trust, I had been holding on to echoes of them, rather than their substance. Grief came not as a sudden storm but as a slow, steady rain, soaking into the soil of my heart, softening it, making space where something new might one day grow. This wasn't a grief marked by bitterness or resentment, but one of profound loss and mourning for something intangible yet deeply felt. The dreams I held, the shared future I envisioned, quietly unraveled. I mourned the version of us that had been my refuge, my anchor in times of uncertainty. It was a private sorrow, one I carried with a strange kind of tenderness, recognizing that I had loved not just him but the idea of us. With this clarity, a distance formed, not a cold detachment born of anger, but a gentle stepping back, a necessary breathing space. I began to see him less as the partner I had hoped for and more as a man flawed and limited, someone who had lived a life partially apart from me even while we were under the same roof. This emotional detachment was not about turning away in hatred, but about safeguarding my own sense of self, preserving the fragile pieces of my identity that had become entangled in the web of his secrets. In that space, I found a strange kind of freedom. The loss was real, yet within it was the possibility of reclaiming my truth. I no longer needed to reconcile the contradictions, to patch together a narrative that no longer fit. Instead, I could begin to listen to my own voice, to honor my feelings without shame or doubt. The marriage I thought I had may have been a mirage, but what remained was my own resilience, my capacity to rebuild from the ruins with honesty as my foundation. This internal reckoning was a quiet revolution. It reshaped my understanding of love, trust, and what it means to truly share a life with someone. I learned that sometimes, the most painful clarity is also the most necessary one. It allows us to shed illusions and face reality with open eyes, even when it hurts. And in that openness, there is room for hope, hope not for what was lost, but for what might be found when we embrace ourselves fully, without compromise or disguise. Discovering the truth I uncovered was like stepping into a shadow far darker than any I had imagined. If it had been cheating, the pain would have cut deeply, yes, but at least it would have been a betrayal I could define, a wound I could begin to heal. Instead, what I faced was a betrayal so complex and layered that it unraveled the very foundation of what I thought I knew, not just about my partner, but about myself. It was a truth that forced me to confront my deepest fears, my blind spots, and the limits of my own trust. Cheating, painful as it is, carries an almost tangible clarity. You can identify the act, name the hurt, and set boundaries around it. But when the truth lies in deception far beyond a simple betrayal of fidelity, when it invades your sense of reality, your security, and your identity, the process of healing becomes labyrinthine. I realized that no matter how much I wanted to hold on to the hope of restoration, the truth demanded that I rebuild myself from the ground up. This journey taught me the power of intuition. I had ignored the quiet alarms in my heart, the subtle dissonances that whispered something was wrong. Now I understand that trusting those instincts is not paranoia, but a vital act of self-preservation. Listening to those inner signals earlier might have saved me years of confusion and pain. I also learned the importance of boundaries, not just with others, but with myself. Setting clear limits on what I would accept and what I would not was essential. It was a declaration that my well-being mattered, that I deserved honesty and respect. Boundaries became the framework for reclaiming my peace and autonomy. Ultimately, this experience was a hard lesson in self-love. I had to choose myself in a way I never had before, to protect my heart and nurture my own growth. It was not easy, but it was necessary. If you have ever feared uncovering a truth worse than cheating, you are not alone. Please share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and you might be the light someone else needs in their darkness. If you found this video meaningful, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe for more honest stories about hidden truths inside relationships. Together, we can build a community of strength, healing, and hope.